Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 126. If you don't have a biological mama bear, police-issued works fine. Now Moss's plan was timed immaculately as he opened his office door to the sight of a stout woman poised to knock. She opened her mouth to speak, but now Mossa put a hand up to cut her off before she started. Midoriya still needed a minute, and thankfully she seemed to understand his rather rude interruption. He nodded down the hall to signal her to follow as he shut the door quietly behind himself. This is going to be a rather peculiar case. Now Mossa started as he ushered her into an empty meeting room. What do you know so far? All I know is that it's an abandonment case for a 15-year-old boy, she responded succinctly. Why don't you take a seat? I'm going to debrief you before we go in there. I don't want to make him repeat anything in the state he's in. The name's Tsukashi, by the way, Detective Tsukashi. He introduced himself and offered out his hand to shake. Miyoshi Masa, nice to meet you, she replied, taking his hand and shaking it firmly. He just nodded at her in response. He didn't want to be rude, but he just didn't have the mental bandwidth for pleasantries at the moment. All right, the kid's name is Midoriya Izuku. He's a hero student at UA, and his teacher found him out on the north side of Mustafu earlier tonight. His father has been out of the picture since he was 7. His mother abandoned him just before he turned 12, and he's been living on the streets for about 4 years now, he stated bluntly. To her credit, she didn't react much beyond a surprised raise of an eyebrow at his last comment. I got a preliminary statement, but we had to stop because it was too much for him. I am familiar with him already. I interviewed him after the UA break-in about a month ago, and we have a good rapport. He's in my office right now with his teacher, who has a strong rapport with him as well. They were together during the incident at UA, so they're quite close. The teacher's name is Aizawa Shota. He and his partner both have foster licenses and are willing to take the kid in. We just need you to sign off on it. I really do think it's the best placement for him. I've been working with Aizawa for years and can personally vouch for his integrity, he finally concluded. Peculiar indeed, Miyoshi responded after pausing for a moment to take it all in. Masa scoffed out a humorless laugh at that. He's distraught at the moment. Normally, I would advise getting a statement out of the way, but kids aren't really my specialty. Not to mention his statement is practically his whole life story. Now Masa trailed off, letting Miyoshi pick up on his non-question herself. You have enough of a statement to start the case against his mother? She asked. Yes, but there's also... I was looking into our database just to see if anything came up. There was nothing for the mother, Midoriya Inko, but the father, Midoriya Hisashi, was already in the system. He's got multiple charges for drug possession, and he was found dead in Tokyo from an overdose 4 years ago. I don't think the kid has any idea that he's dead, he explained. Well, I don't think you should tell him that right now if that's what you're asking, she replied. Yes, it was. I figured as much, but someone's got to tell him eventually. One problem at a time, detective, she said with a practiced tight-lined smile. Yeah, he sighed as he dragged his hand through his hair and pulled out his phone. Tsukashi, let me know when to bring her in. Aizawa, now's as good a time as any. Aizawa says he's as ready as he's going to get, he relayed to Miyoshi. All right, are there any particular triggers I should know about? She asked as she grabbed her bag and stood to follow him. Not that I'm aware of. When they entered the office she'd initially been sent to, the kid and his teacher were sitting in 2 plush office chairs that had clearly been scooted together recently, if the misplaced side table and indents in the carpet were anything to go by. The man, Aizawa Shota, didn't look like much. He was rather unkempt, but he had very subtly moved into a protective stance between the kid and the door for a moment before relaxing again. That was good, but concerning sign. Why was he so on guard in the heart of a police station? Hello, Midoriya-kun. I am Miyoshi Masa. I'm a social worker, and I will be in charge of your case, she introduced herself, giving a nod of thanks to the detective for pulling up a chair for her. Midoriya didn't respond beyond a barely noticeable nod of acknowledgement. Can I call you Midoriya, or is there another name you would prefer? She continued. Midoriya just shook his head in response. Whether that was because he really didn't mind it or because he just wanted to respond in the only way that didn't require him to speak was unclear. Okay, you can call me Miyoshi or Masa, whichever you're more comfortable with. Midoriya just nodded. The detective here told me you're a student at UA. That's very impressive. You're in the hero course, aren't you? Midoriya shot a nervous glance towards Aizawa briefly before nodding again. Interesting. The detective hadn't been exaggerating when he said that the two had a good rapport. Everything about the kid's body language was telling her that he was scared of everything except for the man next to him. Well, that wasn't true. He had let the detective settle into his blind spot, which required some level of trust, but he wasn't looking toward him for reassurance like he was with his sensei. That's amazing. There's less than 100 spots open for that course, isn't there? Again, Midoriya glanced to his sensei before nodding. 40. Aizawa spoke for the first time, clarifying her statement. Oh my goodness, that's even more impressive. It's your first year there, right? He nodded. That was good. They were only a month and a half into the term. If he had been there for a year and a month, the oversight of his living conditions would have been beyond concerning, and she definitely wouldn't trust his teacher to be competent enough to care for him. His previous school certainly had some explaining to do, but that could wait for another day. I understand it's been a rather tumultuous start. That comment earned her a barely there smirk, which she filed away to analyze later. But beyond that, have you been enjoying it? Predictably, he glanced at Aizawa before nodding. That won't do. He needed to be able to speak or not speak freely. If he was scared of offending his teacher, then there was no way she was going to get the full truth out of him, and moreover, she wasn't going to be able to speak freely about her concerns to Aizawa with Midoriya in the room. That's good to hear. Aizawa-san, may I speak with you privately for a moment? The man in question looked vaguely surprised to be addressed, but he didn't seem to emote much in general, so for all she knew, he was downright flabbergasted. He glanced at Midoriya the same way Midoriya glanced at him before he answered, Of course. Aizawa conceded, standing up from his seat. Midoriya seemed uncomfortable by the growing distance between them, but he made no move to stop it. She got to her feet and led the man down the hall to the room that the detective had taken her earlier. Hopefully they wouldn't be disturbed here. She sat in the seat she had used last time and gestured for Aizawa to take the seat opposite from her. The detective told me you have a partner. Are they available to come to the station? She asked, even though it wasn't really a request. That kid wasn't going home with anyone she hadn't vetted. Yes, they're on their way now. They should be here soon. The man spoke with as much emotion as he showed on his face, which was to say none at all. She was more than a little concerned that Aizawa was too cold to properly care for a severely traumatized child, regardless of the trust they had in one another, but everyone was different. She needed more information before she could say anything with certainty. Trust was a good start, though. Tell me about Midoriya, she prompted. What about him? I know his situation, but I don't know him, and I don't know you. So let's kill two birds with one stone. Tell me about him. Aizawa was clearly caught off guard by the request, but he took it in stride. He's one of my first years, very dedicated, very intelligent. He's shy on a good day, though. I wouldn't be surprised if you don't get a single word out of him tonight. She just nodded in response, wordlessly prodding him to go on. He gets along with nearly the whole class, all the staff as well. He was elected class president, but he forfeited it. He's a good leader when he gets out of his own head enough. Information was useful, but it wasn't really getting her anywhere. The man was too professional for her to read much into his sincerity. Detective Sakashi told me that you two were together for the duration of the break-in at UA. Can you tell me about that? Aizawa hesitated for a moment before he responded. We weren't together the entire time, mostly toward the end. A lot of the information is confidential, so I can't share many details with you, but we were both severely injured. It was traumatic. I don't think you should bring that up with him. He responded coolly. I wasn't planning on it. He seems to trust you, which is good, but I need to know if that trust is well founded. You said you were both severely injured, but this was several weeks ago now. Why wasn't his mother contacted? I was in the hospital for most of the ordeal. It is my understanding that we had attempted to contact the number we had for her on file multiple times, but she didn't answer. There was a secondary emergency contact on file that did show up, though. Midoriya had fabricated texts with his mother as well as a phone call after he had been discharged from the hospital. The school had scheduled a wellness check meeting with who we had thought to be his mother, but obviously that never happened. This other emergency contact, why haven't they been called tonight? Good gosh, if this woman made them call Yagi in right now, he was going to freaking lose it. That man was the absolute last thing they needed in this situation. But Shota didn't understand their relationship enough to explain why that was a terrible idea without making the whole thing sound very suspicious. The contact isn't a relative. They're just another teacher at the school. I don't think that Midoriya wants any more people involved in this than there already are. He responded, hoping that would be enough to dissuade her. So you're just making that decision for him? She shot back. No, you can ask him for yourself if you want, but I'm sure his answer would be the same. She was eyeing him critically enough that he was tempted to activate his quirk. It felt like she was looking through his thoughts. The fear was illogical. It was illegal for people with mental quirks like that to use them professionally without disclaiming it. He was just paranoid that he was going to slip up and ruin the kid's life somehow. He needed to calm down. Tell me honestly, Aizawa, do you think you are the best option for Midoriya, or were you just the first person available? Regardless of getting more people involved, why are you so sure that you were a better option than who he had chosen to be his emergency contact? Well, that was a cutting remark. Jeez. He doubted that whatever bond Midoriya had with Yagi surpassed the 2.5 years of partnership they had under their belts, but he couldn't exactly explain that to Miyoshi. They're a high-profile hero. Putting Midoriya under their care would be a danger to both of them should their relationship be publicized. He answered, doing his best to keep the childish insecurity out of his tone. Moreover, we don't even know if they would be willing to take him in. I don't think we need to present him with another opportunity to be rejected, he tacked on. She was trying to throw him off. He knew that, but he wasn't going to let her. He knew he should be grateful that she was taking this seriously. Midoriya's well-being should be her number one priority, but the situation was more delicate than she needed to be privy to. Masa didn't revel in getting a rise out of the man, but she needed to know that he was emotionally available enough to be there for Midoriya. She didn't get much out of him, but there was something, enough for her to be tentatively hopeful. The man seemed to care about the kid, but whether that was born of guilt for failing to catch this sooner or if it was genuine, she didn't know. Either way, she doubted that he would allow himself to let Midoriya down for a second time, and that was good enough for now. Assuming his partner was similarly on board and Midoriya had no complaints, she felt comfortable leaving him in their care until they could discuss things at a more reasonable hour. It was pushing 1 a.m., and she was sure everyone wanted to go home as much as she did. All right, I would like to speak with Midoriya as well as your partner before I okay a temporary placement, she concluded. I don't think you're going to get much out of him. Aizawa warned, seeming a bit antsy to get back to Midoriya. That was a good sign, but also something to look out for. Smothering him wasn't going to do him any favors in the long run. Yes, I know, but I will be giving him the opportunity regardless, she insisted, not unkindly. Now, please wait here. I'd rather not move Midoriya around more than necessary, assuming Detective Tsukashi is amenable to me taking over his office for a moment. Izuku felt distant, which wasn't an unfamiliar feeling. What he felt distant from was new, though. He felt like a rag that had just been wrung out with extreme force and prejudice. It wasn't necessarily unpleasant. He didn't feel bad. He didn't really feel anything. He figured that he should probably be worried about that, but he didn't have the energy to care. He'd been so wound up and tense, and now it felt like it all had burst out of him and floated away. He felt lighter, but he also felt empty. Midoriya. Oh, the woman from earlier was back. But Eraser wasn't. He didn't like that, and Suko was gone now too. He didn't like that either. Can you hear me, kiddo? Kiddo? Mike called him kiddo, but she wasn't Mike. He was supposed to be here too, wasn't he? Where was he? How long had Izuku been here? He felt himself nod in response to her question, but he only half understood what she had even asked him. Good. You seem tired. Are you comfortable going home with Aizawa and his partner to sleep tonight? He didn't think he was going to be comfortable anywhere, but that certainly seemed like a better place to be than here, so he nodded. Do you feel safe with them? That was essentially the same question, and he had the same answer, so he nodded again. The woman was handing him something now. He didn't know how long he looked at it before he took it, but she still had a pleasant smile on her face, so it probably couldn't have been too long. It registered somewhere in his mind that it was a business card, but he couldn't make out any of the numbers or words. It was all too fuzzy. I want you to call me if you don't feel safe or if you don't want to be there anymore. I have my phone on me 24/7, but if it's an emergency, call the police first, okay? Why was she explaining the purpose of the police to him? He was going to be with two heroes anyway. What would he need to call the police for when they would be there the whole time? The police wouldn't help someone like him anyway. Wait, no, spiraling. She was trying to help. She didn't know what he was. Mike and Eraser didn't know what he was. The police didn't know what he was. Everything was fine. Well, no, it wasn't. But they were trying to help. They weren't going to hurt him. They would have done it already if they were going to hurt him. Right? Of all the emotions to creep back to him, why did it have to be fear? He pushed the feeling back again and let it lazily float away until he didn't feel it at all, and the not unpleasant staticky feeling of emptiness returned. He nodded again and she smiled at him before getting up and leaving the room. Hisashi burst through the door not long after Tsukachi had joined him. He looked a little frazzled and very worried. How's he doing? They asked immediately. Not great, but he was getting a bit better last I saw him, Shota replied. That didn't last long once you left. He was completely out of it by the time she came back to my office. I don't think he even me leaving, Tsukachi added. He let out a sigh at that and watched Hisashi's shoulders droop like he was frowning with his whole body. How long has it been? They asked. I texted you right when she left her interrogation with me, so maybe 9, 10 minutes? 12, Tsukachi corrected, looking at the clock in the corner of the room. She's going to interrogate you too once she's done in there, he warned. Why do you keep saying interrogate? What did she do? Zashi asked nervously. She was trying to get a rise out of me. It's good that she's taking this seriously, but don't let yourself fly off the handle. She wanted to know how he's been enrolled for over a month without anyone having caught this. She doesn't want him sent to another negligent home, so just keep your cool. If she asks you why the emergency contact he had at the hospital wasn't called, tell her he's too high profile for that to be a safe placement or something, he instructed. Just as he finished his statement, the door opened and Miyoshi-san walked in. Oh, hi. You must be Aizawa's partner. I forgot to ask him earlier, but have you met Midoriya yet? She asked. Huh. Yeah, I've met him. I work at UA too. I've got the kiddo for English. Hizashi replied easily, expertly shaking off his apprehension before he turned around to greet her. Miyoshi drew her eyebrows together in confusion before they raised in recognition. Oh, you're Present Mike. I didn't recognize you without the. She cut herself off with a slight blush on her cheeks and gestured above her head, wiggling her fingers in a imitation of Zashi's ridiculous plumage. His Shota couldn't hold back a snort at that, but he pursed his lips quickly and schooled his expression. Oi, don't you laugh at me. That's half the point of a get-up, Hizashi chided. Sorry, she cleared her throat and turned her focus back to Tsukashi and himself. Your office is yours again. Thank you for letting me borrow it. Midoriya seems rather out of it at the moment, so be cautious about that. Present Mike, if I could have a word with you. Call me Yamada, he heard Zashi dismiss as he quickly made his way out the door to check on Midoriya. They hadn't been kidding when they said he was out of it. Usually Midoriya's focus was a tripwire. He'd whip his head up at any noise in the classroom, but just now, it had taken him a solid 5 seconds to even realize Shota was sitting in front of him. He offered his hand out, palm up, in an effort to ground him, and he looked at it for a long time before handing him the card he'd been holding. Shota huffed out a laugh at that, set the card down on the armrest before offering out his hand again. Midoriya eyed the offered hand again, looking even more confused than he had the first time, so Shota slowly moved his hand and wrapped it around Midoriya's. He looked at their joined hands for a moment before shifting his focus up to Shota's face. His expression was blank, but Shota could tell he was exhausted. We'll go home soon. Then you can get some sleep, he promised. As worried as he had been in his own interrogation interview, he wasn't nearly as worried about Hizashi's. He knew how to field questions far better than Shota did. Midoriya was coming home with them, and he was going to stay there for as long as he could keep him. He tried not to get his hopes up, believing he would stay with them forever. Well, obviously not forever, but until he graduated or whenever he went out to live on his own. He knew Ivy well enough to know that they wouldn't want to stay anywhere if they felt they were being a burden. And he knew Midoriya enough to know that he was going to feel like a burden no matter where he was. So all they could do was make him feel welcome. They could do that. They could make him feel welcome in their home. Or at least they could do their best. Entertaining the thought that he was going to have to trust someone else to keep Midoriya safe wasn't something he had stomach to ponder right now anyway. As Izuku sat there in Tsukachi's office with Eraser holding his hand, he never felt so much like a child. Some quiet, distant part of him was trying to fight its way out and gather up the remaining scraps of his dignity, but it was of no use. He didn't have the energy to feel anything. Time felt more like a bowl of poorly set jello than a fixed linear line like it was supposed to. He had no idea how long he sat there, but eventually Mike walked into the room with a gentle smile on their face. They said something, but the words didn't mean anything to him. They got lost somewhere among the jello. Eraser squeezed his hand gently, prompting his attention back. Eraser had a small smile on his face now, too. Whatever Mike said must have been good then, or at least he hoped so. After that, Eraser stood up, but he didn't let go of Izuku's hand. His mouth was moving when Izuku shifted his attention up, but just like with Mike, the sound that came out didn't mean anything to him. He did it a couple more times before Izuku looked around the room to try and figure out if there were any clues pointing him toward figuring out what Eraser was trying to say. The lady from before was standing next to Suka at his desk, and Mike was standing in the doorway swinging car keys around their finger and smiling at him. When his focus turned back to Eraser, he nodded his head toward the door, and it finally clicked. They were leaving now. Oh, shit, how long had he been just sitting there like an idiot? He quickly scrambled to his rather unsteady feet, and when he tried to pull his hand away from Eraser, his grip didn't slacken at all. He held firm until Izuku had steadied himself, and then he loosened it. He didn't let go. He just released him enough for Izuku to pull his hand away if he wanted to. He felt untethered. He didn't want to let go, but he did anyway. He needed to pull himself together. When Hisashi walked back into Tsukashi's office after his interrogation interview, Midori appeared to be in the worst state they'd seen since last night. Shota was kneeling on the ground in front of him and holding his hand while the kiddo stared at his capture scarf without really seeing it. Shota had told them the first week of school how honed Midoriya's spatial and situational awareness was, and they had noticed it too. There was no sign of that skill in the boy sitting in front of them. Two people had just walked in the room, and it didn't seem like he noticed them at all. "Hey, kiddo," they greeted. No response. "We've got some good news." They tried again. No response. "I don't think you're going to get a response, Ash," Shota replied quietly. When Shota turned to speak to them, Midoriya looked up and followed his gaze back over to Hisashi. They did their best to hide any concern on their face and gave him a calm smile. "You're coming home with us tonight, kiddo," they said slowly, and clearly hoping that he would catch even a single word. Not even the barest hint of recognition crossed his face. Damn it. "We're going home now, Midoriya. Is that all right?" Sho asked after calling the kid's attention back to him. Nothing. "Can you stand up for me, kid?" Shota tried again. Nothing. Sho let out a small sigh at that and stood up slowly, and Midoriya responded to that. He looked up at Shota with wide eyes and started looking around the room. When his eyes fell on them, they took out their keys and swirled them around their finger. Hopefully a visual cue would help. As he looked back to Shota, Sho nodded his head toward the door, and the kid stood up like this chair had caught fire. He swayed on his unsteady feet, but Sho made sure he didn't fall. "Hey, kiddo, careful. We're not in a rush." They tried to calm him, but they doubted that he heard a word of that. The kid took a shaky step away from Shota, and they could see how that broke Sho's heart. He tensed his shoulders and pursed his lips, but he didn't make any move to try and get back into the kid's personal space. Everyone stood still for a moment as Midoriya's gaze flicked between the two of them. "Just go. He'll follow," Sho prompted, nodding his head toward the door again. As Shota said, the moment they took a step back, Midoriya took a step toward the door. Still leaving plenty of room for Shota to exit before him, he didn't seem to want to be surrounded. They nodded to the detective and the social worker before they turned and let the other two follow them down the hall. They paid attention, looking behind themselves every so often to slow their pace and let Midoriya catch up. He looked exhausted and couldn't keep up with his and Sho's much longer strides. They all got to the car eventually, but Shota needed to turn around in his seat and shake his seatbelt at the kid before he got the memo and buckled himself in quickly with a blush high on his cheeks. He kept the radio on, but at a very low volume, hoping that it might calm the poor kid or bring him back down to earth, but it didn't seem to help. He was just as out of it on the walk back into the apartment, and he didn't say a word to either of them before shutting his door so quietly that they're sure he had to have turned the knob from the other side and slowly twisted it back into place. "Have you ever seen him like that?" they asked Shota a few seconds after the door shut. Shota just stood there, chewing at his lip for a moment before shaking his head. "No, I mean, they've had, or at least I think they've had flashbacks in front of me, and they've been lost in their own head before, but not like that." I mean, there was a few times they were out of it, but they snapped back. I don't. Shota trailed off and ran a hand over his face before sitting heavily on the couch. Kimchi came over and brushed up against his leg, and he dropped the hand that wasn't holding his head up down to pet her absent-mindedly. He was looking off into nothing and didn't seem like he was about to move anytime soon. We should get his stuff tomorrow. Do you think that's going to be too much for him to handle? They asked as they sat down next to him. Shota let out another sigh at that and brought the hand that had been petting Kimchi back up to his face. With his eyes pressed into the heels of his hands and elbows resting on his knees, he looked so small. I don't know, Zashi. I don't know anything, he said in a quiet, broken voice. They draped an arm over his back, running their hand along the curve of his spine for a moment before sliding it up against his scalp, making sure not to pull on the curls. Frankly, it would be crazy if you did know what to do in the situation show. It's, he paused for a moment, trying to find the words. Unprecedented, he decided. Sho let out a humorless huff of laughter at that and shook his head. We'll figure it out together, they insisted. He's safe now, and we'll figure it out. They had no clue how they would, but he knew that they would. Somehow, some way, they would figure this all out. End of chapter.